Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, because there are so many excellencies here on the podium, but also in the auditorium. Thank you very much for coming to this event, which is organized by the International Institute for Peace. My name is Hannes Svoboda, as president of the Institute, and in cooperation with the Diplomats Without Borders and the Global Relations Forum. And in particular, I want to thank Ozat Rubani and Clem McCartney. They are here for initiating and giving us the chance to hopefully not misuse, their meeting here in Vienna for this event, because I thought when there are so excellent people here, we should not miss the opportunity to have a discussion about diplomacy in the age of conflicts. I think I don't have to mention that there is no better opportunity, unfortunately, to speak about that issue if we look to the world of today. And I mean exactly today, if we look what happens in the Middle East, when there is an agreement on a truce which could bring diplomacy into play, then immediately they are not agreeing on what is part of the agreement, if Lebanon is part of the agreement or not, and the fighting continues. So I think we all are convinced, or at least here, that diplomacy should play a bigger role instead of war, and perhaps also, of course, to solve conflicts and end wars. Now, I want to welcome especially, of course, the panel here who were ready to discuss and to introduce the discussion. I may start with Victoria Rosa. She's an ambassador of Moldova to Austria. So she is not yet part of Diplomats Without Borders, because it's more or less for the retired diplomats. But you still have borders, but you have not easy borders anyway in your own country. When we speak about Transnistria and also the debate with Romania. But thank you very much for coming. Marta Ruedas. She's coming from Spain, from Madrid, and therefore also the Spanish ambassador is here. And thank you very much for coming. She's also a very active ambassador here in Austria, and we are very happy to have her here. And then I want to welcome Selim Yenel, who is former ambassador to Austria and to the European Union and many other places. And as I said before, is my Turkish ambassador, because I had the opportunity to speak with him very often on the question of, including the question which is still unresolved on Turkish membership of the European Union. And then last but not least, I mention it last because he will be the first speaker, Kees Rade, who is founder and chair of Diplomats Without Borders and many other issues, from a Dutch ambassador to such strange, for us, strange places like Nicaragua, Brazil, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, but also has been on the multilateral issues in the Dutch Foreign Ministry. So the idea is that Kees Rade makes a brief introduction on what is Diplomats Without Borders, and then go into his own experience, and then the other colleagues will join, and we will have a discussion in the panel here how diplomacy can be enhanced, can be supported, in spite of what is now happening in the world, that many leaders, and too many leaders, especially the leaders of the big countries, are more or less saying war and force is better and more effective than diplomacy. And then, of course, we will have some Q&A. Please, Kees, it's you who can start now.
Well, thank you very much for this very warm introduction, and thank you more in general for hosting this event and facilitating it. So we're very grateful to be here as your guests, as your speakers. It's also a pleasure to see, of course, the other members and my co-DWB member, but also Selim. And with Selim, we have a very intense cooperation with the Global Relations Forum. Actually, we are also tomorrow talking about preparing a conference linked with the NATO summit that will, assuming that it will take place in July in Turkey, and we want to use it.
With or without
well, let's
Mr. Trump.
assume there will be. Well, let's not go into that. And our focus will be, there's a lot of talk about defense, strength, building up military capacities, but what about diplomacy? I mean, that will be the focus of the conference. And again, we prepared it together in quite an intense process, so that looks very interesting. Very briefly about Diplomats Without Borders. Probably you have never heard of us because we are a very young organization. I mean, for an organization, we are 4 years old almost, but of course for an organization that's very young. And basically, we were inspired by Médecins Sans Frontières, that I'm sure you all know very well, which I think is a fantastic example of a profession, doctors, who decided that they have something to offer to this planet apart from helping their patients. It started in Paris, and they said, well, but is this really what we are about? Shouldn't we go to the more difficult places in the world? Anyway, that was half a century ago, and now it is this fantastic organization. So basically, we started discussing this with a few other diplomats, like, why isn't there actually a Diplomats Without Borders? Because we also have a skill, and that's something we'll talk about today. And of course, as long as we work for our governments or for the United Nations, you cannot at the same time be active on the same kind of issues in another organization. But if you limit the membership to former senior diplomats, it's a different story, because then you don't have, it's so wonderful, no headquarters, no ministers, nothing. You have your experience of several decades in diplomacy. And anyway, we decided to found Diplomats Without Borders, and today we are actually, just the day before yesterday, we welcomed an Indian former diplomat who is our 100th member. So, and I understand we might welcome a 101st soon. So thank you for that. And basically we focus on 3 areas: conflict, training, and promoting diplomacy. And promoting diplomacy is very much participating in these kind of events and every time stressing the importance of diplomacy instead of, well, what we see happening today. And of course, conflict, because you're mainly focusing on conflict, I believe. We are focusing on 4 conflict situations: Myanmar, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Libya. Needless to say, not very easy cases, but we try to contribute our little, what we can, in terms of, let's say, former diplomats without any kind of headquarters or just our individual capacity. So this by way of introduction. And then a couple of remarks, and again, we are under strict time rules, so I see it more as an annotated agenda for the discussion later on. So I will just mention a few thoughts, and then of course we can expand that later on in the discussion. Well, obviously, and also the main issue of this debate is what's happening with the world, what's happening with the rules-based order, what's happening with diplomacy. We see a seizure, we see a total change in international relations. At least that is the impression one gets when one looks at the headlines. But if you analyze it, is it really so that what's happening today is totally different from what happened, say, the last 40 years? If you look at the facts, at the actual armed interventions, I mean, and I wrote them down, but you have quite an impressive list. You have Grenada in 83, you have Panama in 89, Haiti in 94, Afghanistan. Remember that we were talking about Afghanistan on a daily basis because all this war was happening there in 2001. Iraq, 2003, Libya, 2011, and then of course many more, let's say, a bit smaller interventions. So it is not like what's happening in Iran and Venezuela is a total sea change. I mean, it gets a lot of publicity, but I feel, I mean, compare Iraq and Iran. In Iraq, the US had 150,000 troops, and now they had around 40,000, so a third. In Iraq, they had more than 800 airplanes, and now in Iran, they used around 100. I mean, rough figures. So in that sense, their intervention in Iran, if you compare it with Iraq, is much more limited. So what is really different today than 10, 20, 30 years ago? And I think three elements that I want to mention. The first one, something that is not different, but that is, I think, getting more and more attention, is the focus of the US on China. And I think this is more and more dominating the decision-making in Washington. For example, a very small example, but if you think about the fact that I think 90% of the oil of Venezuela was going to China. I think 85% of the oil of Iran was going to China. And not only that, but also it was paid in yuan and not in dollars, which of course could contribute to the undermining of the position of the US dollar as a world reserve. So these kind of thoughts, I'm sure, also played a role in the decision of the US to intervene in Venezuela. So China is very prominently present, of course, at the expense, or that has an impact on the way they look at Europe, and that is certainly something for the discussion. I won't go into it now, but let me just say one catchword is that we should really try to find other partnerships. And I think personally, especially China, and forget a bit our very hesitant attitude, like they're the enemy and so on. I think we should be much more open towards China. But that's definitely for the discussion. Second element that is different now, I think, from previous interventions is the narrative. And of course, the narrative is absolutely horrendous. If you read all these statements on Truth Social and I mean, there's not even an attempt to explain the intervention by mentioning the interest of the American people. And if you look at the impact on, for example, the oil prices, I mean, the prices go up at the US pump. But on the other hand, the oil companies are being serviced by these interventions. So, and again, the narrative is 100% MAGA, no matter what you think about it, but it's of a bluntness that I think for Europeans in general is quite interesting. And previously, at least when the US was intervening, like for example in Iraq, at least they said it was for human rights, it was for democracy and so on. But even that, there was some mentioning of democracy, the Venezuelan people. But what would have been more logical once you took out Maduro, to then ask the person who won the democratic elections that were respected by everybody, what would be more logical to bring her back? But the whole issue has disappeared after the moment that the US got a grip on the Venezuelan oil system. So human rights totally out of the equation. Same with Iraq, by the way. So I think the narrative is totally different from what it used to be. And my last point is, and that is something I think talking about diplomacy, which is extremely worrying, of course, is the fact that the whole multilateral system is being thrown out of the window. And that is definitely something we should work about. I mean, why? Not because, as Mark Carney said, nostalgia is not a policy. So we should not say, oh, but we have this rules-based order after the Second World War and it has to come back. That won't work. So we really need arguments. And I think I will mention very briefly, three arguments, and then I'll stop. One, I think we have to explain much better the importance and the necessity of having a well-functioning multilateral system. We have global challenges with climate, of course, is the obvious example that we only can solve together, not on a bilateral basis. We need the multilateral system. We need multilateral system for rules and regulations. And we need a multilateral system for conflict resolution. Ultimately, if you want to do it through democracy, you need to use the multilateral system. So we have to explain much better, I think, why the multilateral system is so essential for all of us in the medium to longer term. Secondly, of course, we have to make the multilateral system more effective. And we have to admit, I mean, I work together with a few other people here at the UN, at our mission to the UN, and we have other people working in Geneva with the UN. I mean, there is a lot of room for improvement, for more efficiency and so on. But we have to work seriously on it. And the obvious example is the UN Security Council, which of course is also something we could discuss here. What should happen to make that more realistic? And two last thoughts on making the system more effective. One, why not go for the Article 109 of the Charter, which allows a charter review conference, and the conditions are not even that impossible to achieve. The veto doesn't apply to organizing the conference. So perhaps there would be possibilities for an Article 109 conference, at least to work on it. So I think that's important. And let me see. Well, I see I spent my time, and well, let's leave it at that. Actually, the rest perhaps for a discussion.
No, thank you very much. Because we want to discuss, I will a bit look for the cohesiveness of the presentation. But I think it was very important for me, two elements, and the one was, the world before was not a heaven. It was not really a good one either. So there is not that kind of dramatic change on the one hand. But what is important, of course, is that we have to look especially also to the multilateral organizations, which unfortunately don't function in the way that they should. Organizational issues, but of course also political issues, which is very important. But the critical element we have to discuss, of course, is China. Is China really so innocent as it is sometimes presented? And is it an alternative? Especially if we see, but maybe we can come later, the cooperation between China and Russia on some ugly issues, like including on the Ukraine war. But that's another issue. Selim, you want to come in, please.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be back in Vienna. It's one of my favorite cities, and I'm very happy and honored to see so many ambassadors, Turkish ambassadors also included in this audience. So thank you very much for being here. A brief word about the organization that I represent, the Global Relations Forum. It has existed since 2009. It's a think tank, and it works like a think tank. So we organize meetings on, relevant issues, subjects that are interesting to everybody. And what we do is try to invite people, have them experts, of course, from all around the world. And since COVID, we are now using Zoom much more, so we can invite people from all around the world. And then when we have these meetings, we, summarize them and send them out to our members. We have about 400 members. 1/3 of them are ex-diplomats, bureaucrats, a third of them are business people, and a third of them are from our academia. So this is our organization, and I used to be the president until a week ago. So I'm not a president anymore, but I just still want to represent this organization. Now, talking about diplomacy, diplomacy should have evolved, and it has evolved in the past, but now I see it as devolving. What do I mean? We've seen that diplomacy until the 19th century was basically personalized, and we discussed this with Keith before, that it was the domain of the ruler, the king, the sultan, whatever, and they would give diplomacy or the duty of diplomatic endeavors to those who they trusted. So it was, in a sense, people who had the trust of the leader, but not very experienced. But of course, that evolved later on, in which the foreign ministries were created. So a diplomatic corps was established, and therefore diplomacy was institutionalized. And this served us very well, especially during the Cold War. That way, we were able to manage a very difficult period when we had two nuclear powers on the verge of war at times. But this was handled very carefully through diplomacy. So diplomacy can help with regard to preventing war and probably ending it. But right now we're facing a totally different situation. We're going back to the era in which diplomacy is again being personalized. We see that in Russia, we see that in the United States, we see it in many other places. And we see this as a danger, because To be very specific about what's happening today, we heard that Vice President Vance is going with Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and also his business partner, Mr. Witkoff. What do they know? About diplomacy. Yes, they might be able to negotiate deals in the consumer business, but we're talking about dealing with Iran. Now, in that sense, they would have been very well helped if a diplomatic corps gave them the proper information about how to deal with Iran. What kind of a country is this? That even if you bomb it all the way, that they will still resist. They probably thought it would be easy to do it like they did it in Venezuela. But countries are totally different. The Arab countries are different. Iran is different. So this is the problem that diplomacy is facing right now. We see that also in the UN. You just mentioned international organizations. They have suffered because they were not able to solve many problems that we were facing. What do we call them? Frozen conflicts. Why are they frozen? Because we haven't been able to solve them. The Minsk process with regard to Nagorno-Karabakh was solved by military means because diplomats could not solve it for 3 decades. Cyprus, another issue that is, of course, very important for us, has not been solved diplomatically. But because Turkey is there can be no other way of resolving it because I don't think that anybody could attack Turkey in that sense. So military might is important, but diplomacy is much more important to prevent these kinds of issues. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to take back diplomacy. We have to, again, show that diplomats can work. Diplomats without borders, real diplomats right now who are active, and diplomats who do things behind, closed doors. Track 2. Sometimes we call it track 1.5, track 2, but these are the efforts that are used to solve intractable problems. But this is not used as it was before. That's the problem that we are facing. So how do we bring back diplomacy? It's a tall issue. And of course, nevertheless, I don't want to belittle the leaders. Leadership is very important because in the end, they will decide on what the diplomats present them. And of course, it's very important that the diplomats present them with enough options that could be very useful for an off-road to have them or give them an exit, especially right now. Mr. Trump is seeking an exit. He made a blunder, he made a mistake, and he's now looking for a way out. And only the diplomats could provide that. We see that with Pakistan. They're trying to help very much, which is very, very, I think, useful. But in the end, they are doing it, in a sense, as a go-between. And that's not easy. If the diplomats between the US and Iran got together in the same room, that could have been different. But right now, we're facing a situation in which they have to, use third parties. And therefore, there's always a problem of lost in translation. Not only with regard to language, but also with regard to demeanor, the way that people act. And of course, you have to know the way in which an American would act, about an Iranian would act. And so diplomats are the crucial people there. They are the experts on providing the necessary information. So I'll stop here. I just want to provide some latitude on what diplomacy is and how it should be strengthened. It could be strengthened, but I don't know how to strengthen it. I'll stop here.
No, thank you very much. I don't know if you read the article in the New York Times, the national edition of today, where it's very clear that all the experts advised Mr. Trump to be very careful and said it's not really, I must say, including Mr. Vance, which is not my favorite, but anyway, but the political will by Netanyahu and by Trump was already here to go for the war, and all the experts' opinion or hesitation was put aside. But may I just briefly ask, why do you think is that change taking place, that leaders don't want experts from the diplomacy to be active?
I think it's not just diplomacy. I think it's, in general, they don't trust experts anywhere on any subject. We've seen that with COVID. We see that in many, let's say, areas in which the experts failed to provide the answers. But I think that the way in which experts are perceived by the population is, of course, different as well. They expect the experts to know everything. They can't. They can only provide some guidance, some information. And if the information or the guidance that the expert provides is not clear enough or is not, let's say, correct, then they say, well, that guy doesn't know anything. We see that with, of course, the leaders as well. I'm sure that maybe Trump was advised not to do certain things, but he did it, and he was successful. He said, well, these guys don't know anything. I know it much better. So in the end, experts have suffered from not being able to provide all the clear answers. So it's not just for diplomacy, it's in other fields as well. That's how I see it.
Thank you. Marta.
I'm not entirely in agreement.
That's good, because we need a debate.
Yeah. Because I mean, I don't think that experts aren't able to provide the answers. They're just not being listened to necessarily. Because in COVID, you gave the example of COVID. In fact, COVID was remarkable for the speed of production of a vaccine, a revolutionary vaccine, that this speed of reaction had never taken place before, and that was the experts. Now, then you also had Trump, who thought that bleach was a good way to, cure COVID. So, it's a question of listening to. But I would go also because I'm not certain that diplomacy is being personalized everywhere necessarily.
But the big countries are doing it.
Some big countries are doing it, but I think there's more of a tendency right now towards moving to resolving things by conflict, by war, rather than diplomacy. Whether diplomacy is personalized or not, I think there is a tendency at the moment to resolve things by war. I think that there's often this belief that the battlefield will resolve what the boardroom does not. And you actually mentioned some of them. But, this frozen conflict was created by war as well. So, I don't think it's resolved either, Azerbaijan and Armenia. So I think, it's a little bit of a mirage that one more act of war will resolve what has been created by war and is being maintained by war. We see it in Iran very much. We saw it. One more assassination will produce regime change, or one more wave of bombs will make the population rise. It's a little bit of a imaginary thinking that is taking place that is perpetuating conflict. And instead of moving towards some kind of a resolution, which can only happen when really there is a realization that you're stuck, which is where, yes, Trump has gotten to that realization, but I don't think that Netanyahu has. So I think then the role of diplomacy is really to generate this conscience somehow, and also to provide some sort of off-ramp or a series of off-ramps that can make the retreat from this kind of situation a little bit more acceptable, especially because where you have a country like the United States that has indeed personalized diplomacy, personalized decision-making in a conflict, it becomes a personalized decision. You cannot lose face, and then the off-ramp becomes maximally important. Then you get to sort of the, I wrote it down here, but Sun Tzu had this term of the golden bridge, where you have to leave your enemy a way out so that they don't fight to death. And there are a number of ways where that off-ramps can be generated, and we've seen a number of them. We've seen the grain deal in Ukraine. It didn't last for very long, but it was a little window of hope at the time. I think the thing is to try to generate more and then build one on top of the other. You talked, some of you, about multilateral institutions. And I worked in a multilateral institution for my career, so I'm very, very conscious of their flaws, but I'm equally conscious of their potential. And I think there's often a merging that is made in terms of how one views a multilateral institution, one views the UN, let's say, between the inherent flaws in the institution and the flaws of the context within which it works. So the member states themselves generate a lot of flaws that are then sort of projected onto the Secretariat. The Secretariat has enough flaws in and of itself, so I don't think there's a necessity to project the flaws of the member states. So the only thing that I want to say is on multilateral, three things that I want to say. Four? No, just kidding. Okay, so for multilateral institutions, I think they are a very good vehicle for an off-ramp because right now we're seeing in Iran, Pakistan providing a very good off-ramp. But you yourself have mentioned it's a very uncomfortable position for Pakistan. And it's, a multilateral institution depersonalizes a lot further. And it can provide a face-saving vehicle as well, because whoever's in the conflict can say that they're just complying with the international mandate or with a group of countries' advice or something like this. So it sort of eases the way off a lot better. And I think just going then back to the Golden Bridge, I would just say that we need to really create a diplomacy that is bridge builders, rather than deal makers, because if you don't have an off ramp, the only way off the bridge is just
Thank you. I have a lot of remarks, but that will come later. First, Ambassador, you have also need for diplomacy when you think about Transnistria, but is it really possible to have diplomatic activities who can solve the issue, or how do you see the situation? But maybe you want to speak to other issues, please.
Yes, thank you very much for this question, but also thank you very much for the invitation. It's for the first time that I'm participating at the event of the International Institute for Peace in a capacity of a diplomat, as the ambassador of the Republic of Moldova, because previously I was invited in an expert capacity, actually representing an organization which was founded by former and current diplomats. And it is a great pleasure for me to be here and to discuss with all of you. I'm a true believer in diplomacy. Actually, I was trained to become a diplomat, and I'm very happy that now I can follow my dream by building my career as a diplomat, also serving my country, because I do believe that dialogue and building trust are the only way for us to really come to peace, but also to welfare societies. In the case of Moldova, because mostly you would like me to refer to the Republic of Moldova, I think that as a country which has a post-Soviet past, which regained its independence in 1991, and having a secessionist conflict on our territory, we better than anyone else understand how important it is to maintain peace, because human lives are the most important that can be in this world. And I think that one of the main issues that emerge after conflict is the loss of human lives. And this is something that we have to remember actually all the time. It's important for us because since 1992, when the conflict started in the Republic of Moldova, since then we have only one human loss, which happened tragically and unfortunate. But up until now, we didn't had any violent clashes from 1992. And this also happened due to the fact that we maintain all the time the position that we would like to solve the Transnistrian conflict in a peaceful manner and only through dialogue and negotiations. This is something that Moldova is sticking to, and is continuing to promote as its main goal, taking into account that now we aspire very much to become members of the European Union. And for us, even though these two paths are separate, but they are also interdependent in the view of the fact that we would like to join as a reunified reunited country, and with the conflict solved in a peaceful manner. I also wanted to mention the fact that you well know that Moldova is a neutral country, and for us it's important to base our foreign policy, but also security policy, on dialogue and on trust, on building bridges with partners who can support us in ensuring our security, most of all, because what we understood once the Russian aggression in Ukraine is that it is also very important to think about security in every sphere of everyday life of people. Previously, we were not thinking about food security, about energy security, and now they are becoming actually one of the main topics which we are reflecting on when we are discussing the current situation in the Republic of Moldova, energy security being one of the top priorities for our country. And before, I would say 2019 and 2022, we were actually more focused on thinking about justice reform, about anti-corruption, thinking that these sectors would actually be the main sectors that we have to think about when we do envisage a democratic Republic of Moldova. However, now we understand that without security, none of this can happen, actually. And you cannot have a welfare state if security is not ensured, and if human security, first of all, is not ensured. So if you would ask me, I think that when we are talking about conflicts, when we are talking about diplomacy, I think that one of the main tasks of diplomacy is to secure human lives. And this I actually understood very clearly when the war in Ukraine started, and when also here in Austria, in Stadtschleining, we had a conference, and when experts from MENA region were saying, yeah, but you understand this now because the conflict has moved in Europe and you have a conflict on the European continent. But previously, I don't know how preoccupied we were with conflicts outside the European Union, where we were preoccupied if that was part of our daily work, but not necessarily thinking about it as we do think right now in terms of securing human lives, in terms of securing the welfare of children in conflict zones, securing the rights of women in conflict zones, and so on and so forth. And I think that now here in Europe, we developed a different view on everything that it is related to conflict and conflict resolution. And I'm very happy that now it is an unfortunate consequence, but at the same time, now we opened our eyes to the main, I would say, advantages of diplomacy, of dialogue, and of trust building through diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I must be a bit impolite because they were all nice words, but in order to steer up a bit the discussion, I have to say, are they realistic? You mentioned, for example, Azerbaijan and Armenia, and I've been in both countries very often. Was it really possible to solve the issue by diplomacy, or why was it not possible? If one country like Armenia did resist to do anything about coming to an agreement, and on the other hand, Azerbaijan thought, well, finally, I will have enough oil and income to build up the army, and then I take it by military force. Diplomacy had no chance. Iran, building bridges between Iran and Israel, is it realistic? Was there any possibility to build a bridge without one or the other country totally leaving aside their aspiration and their ideas? I think you mentioned Sudan. Now, there were agreement and trying diplomacy, but there were inside and outside actors from the Arab Peninsula to go for war. And you mentioned Ukraine. You are right about Transnistria. You are happy that, in that sense, happy that Transnistria is relatively a peaceful situation because out of different reasons. But in Ukraine, would it have possible to come to an agreement? Well, there were some discussions in Istanbul, but finally it was not really successful. So my counter argument would be diplomacy has very much its limit, and we have now strong men, Muslim men, who don't want diplomacy, and therefore diplomacy has no role to play to solve the big conflicts. Or I am wrong. So please bring me arguments why I'm wrong and diplomacy could have solved all these wars and issues we are confronted with today.
I don't think you're entirely wrong. I mean, you're right on many scores. And in that sense, the international organizations failed in these issues, unfortunately. That's why they were frozen for a long time. The Minsk process, we keep on mentioning that. Nothing happened for 3 decades because the countries involved lost interest in it. And they thought that this could survive for another few years. So diplomacy can only function or work if there's an opportunity from both sides that they really want to solve this issue. But if one side believes that they are strong, then it's very futile that you can do anything. And right now we are seeing that, there was a time in which soft power was very à la mode. That has gone. It's all back to hard power again. And if you listen to that one person that I won't, use any adjective, Mr. Miller, very close to Trump, he is totally for hard power. He says this is the world, and you do get what you want, and those who cannot, they will suffer. So right now we are in this position in which, yes, these men are deciding on these issues, but in the end they will have to resolve these issues somehow, and they will need diplomacy. Diplomacy is there as a tool. So you use it when you need it. Right now, the US needs it, Iran needs it, and that's why they're trying to find a way out. But in the beginning, they didn't need it. They said, Trump thought that he could resolve it by his own way, just like he did it in Venezuela. He thought it would be an easy, cakewalk. It wasn't. So diplomacy has to wait for the right opportunity. So you're right on both scores. You just have to find the right time. Timing is important in diplomacy, as my colleagues will probably attest to that. So it's a tool that has to be used appropriately. That's what I can say right now.
With regard to the possibility of peace between Iran and Israel, the timing issue is an important one, and I'm not sure that it has ever been attempted. But I would point you to Israel itself and ask you to look at its borders. And the only 2 borders that are safe and reliable, let's say, are with countries that have had a negotiated settlement. And the others have not. And they are problematic and conflictual. And Israel is always resorting to conflict with it. So, there is absolutely no problem with Egypt, and nobody expects one. Now, look at history. At the time that the Camp David Accords were made, before that, Egypt was where Iran now stands in terms of conflict with Israel and the way that it approached it. But it achieved a negotiated settlement because there was a will, I agree. But it almost failed, and the will was shaky. Diplomacy found a way. So I fully agree that timing is important, effort is critical, but the results are vastly better and more long-lasting. And again, with Israel, the only 2 borders that it doesn't worry about are the ones where there has been a negotiated settlement. And with Iran, I think things have walked backwards. There was an agreement. There was a negotiated agreement that they're trying to get back to now. Not with regard to Israel, but with regard to everything else. Anyway.
Perhaps picking up on Iran, since you ended with that, to say that indeed you hear from those who were involved in it that there was almost an agreement where both sides could get what they wanted, but then somehow Trump literally blew it in the air. But if you would feed the elements of the Iran-US conflict into AI, and you would ask AI, give me a reasonable middle ground, I'm sure you would get a very interesting result. Ukraine, Russia, if you feed all the elements into AI, I think you would get an outcome which would be first unacceptable for both sides.
So we don't need diplomats, but AI.
No, the AI is the start, but let's hope, and that's more about AI in general. It always remained human activity ultimately that have to bring the solution. But for both conflicts, I think it is not that difficult to find a middle ground. And again, both sides will say it's unacceptable and so on, but objectively speaking, I think it is doable. And that's, I guess, what diplomats could do to talk to each other. And that's, I think, and that's what our main aim is, to engage. If you do not engage, you will never solve problems. And at the moment, there is no engagement. It's only them versus us. And I think that's what we want to do in our conference, to say, come on, guys, we have to talk to each other. And one thing, and some people will probably not agree, but we have also to try to understand the other side, where they're coming from. Why are they doing what they're doing? Because just to say Putin is a crook and he wants to restore the Tsar period and so on, I think it's too simple. We really have to, and reading about, for example, the history of Ukraine, I mean, there have been episodes where, to be honest, also us, NATO was not always kind of the most forthcoming and open negotiating partner. So try to understand the other. Last comment, because we can say this here, but people, I mean, the people in charge don't listen to us. What can we do? And perhaps that's where Europe comes into play. And perhaps that Europe, and this has been said by many people, but Europe should try to really get its act together and to become a player. And assuming that we are still defending something about democracy and liberal values and human rights and so on, with all kinds of comments, but in general, we tend to be, I think, reasonable. If Europe would really be a player, I think we could kind of support this process of engagement and play a meaningful role somewhere.
Well, if you ask me, I will tell you that diplomacy is a two-way street. And I was many times asked, when I was mentioning that I'm also a permanent representative at the OSCE of the Republic of Moldova, and outside the OSCE, people who not necessarily follow the activity of the organization, but also maybe foreign policy and security policies, they ask me, is OSCE still alive? And I'm telling them yes, and it actually takes more than half of my time. Because indeed, I think that multilateralism is very important. And when I was mentioning that diplomacy is a two-way street, it's important to provide your position as a country. It is also important to listen to others in order to understand them better, because only in this way you can find arguments, you can build trust, and you can find a solution. I also agree very much with what you have been mentioning about timing, which is very, very important, because maintaining the dialogue open and seizing the moment when the time is proper to catch that or sign that deal or negotiate a solution, I think it's very important. And this is actually what we are trying to do now. And it's important for us diplomats, but also experts, to communicate to each other and to make that premises that would help the leaders to find the proper moment to find a solution to conflicts, because the conflicts cannot last forever. Because this is exhausting. This is exhausting for states, this is exhausting for humans, this is exhausting for institutions as well. And at some point, they will need the time to recollect, to rebuild, and to start living their lives. In our days, we already understand the benefits of a welfare system. We understand the benefits of life, and each and every one of us wants to live happily, right? And believe me, each and every person in Ukraine who is on the front line, he's thinking about their families, and they would like their families to have a beautiful life, to travel, to enjoy food, to enjoy wines, and so on and so forth. So I think that this is something in the back of the mind of each and every human, that today we are already not thinking only in terms of conflict, but we are also thinking in terms of development, of progress. And this is something that we would actually, and it is our responsibility to remember each and every time to our leaders, to our peers, that we have to build a world which would be better for each and every one of us, and this can be done only through dialogue and negotiations.
Before I go to ask to the Q&A session, because you mentioned also this conflict on Transnistria, and you mentioned other conflicts. We were a delegation recently from the IIP in Cyprus, and on the Turkish side of Cyprus, one colleague said, we are living in a happily frozen conflict. And when we think about the negotiations in Ukraine, the only result could be a frozen conflict. If we think about Iran, probably if there is a solution, it would be a frozen conflict, because Israel will never agree to any kind of agreement where there is not totally extracted out the nuclear facilities, and on the other hand, Iran will insist on it. Transnistria is a frozen conflict. So is perhaps diplomacy here to freeze some conflicts which cannot be solved? Because you mentioned the danger is that it will erupt sometime, as it was with Nagorno-Karabakh. But on the other hand, realistically, something we have to do is to freeze conflicts, because there is no way to solve them. Or am I wrong on that?
Can I briefly jump in on that again? Because you're right, and we have forgotten one frozen conflict, Korea. Yeah. Korea is a frozen conflict. There has never been, a peace deal, a treaty, so it has been frozen for how many decades now? But I want to pick up on what Keith said about trying to understand the other side. Empathy. We discussed this before. Empathy is crucial in diplomacy, and which is quite lacking, because you should understand the other side, not to accept what they're doing, but at least to understand why they're doing it. And there you can play a role in which you can convince your people, your leaders, about how to deal with that other side. And one other point I'd like to make is that this is the time for the middle powers to take up the slack. The middle powers should try to find a way in which the big powers are not doing it. So let us try to find a way to reform the international institutions. For example, the World Trade Organization, it's been stuck for years because of the United States, basically. They're not happy with what the decisions have been taken there. So now I've seen that some countries are trying to circumvent that situation and trying to find deals amongst themselves. So I think there's a role for the middle powers to use their diplomacy, and maybe in the end, the bigger powers will come to their senses, come back and have different leaders, which we hope. And then we can come back to, diplomacy again. And today, diplomacy is not only the classic diplomacy. We have energy diplomacy, we have food diplomacy, as you mentioned, cyber diplomacy. So diplomacy is also changing in itself. So I'll stop here again. If you want to contribute.
I mean, I think the end goal will always be a negotiated settlement, an agreement that is acceptable to all parties. That's one end of the spectrum. and at the other end of the spectrum is an active conflict, right? An active war. A frozen conflict is always preferable to an active war, but the negotiated settlement is always better. And I think, Korea, one half of that peninsula is living reasonably, but the other half is just living, and barely sometimes. I think in the case of Cyprus, it has been this close to a resolution. I don't know how many times. Yeah. Sometimes on one side they were willing to negotiate. Sometimes on the other, never at the same time. Exactly, timing is critical. But I think we never have to stop trying to resolve these frozen conflicts. But by all means, they are preferable to an active conflict.
Frozen conflict, Gaza. I find it difficult to visualize because the way the situation is now is you cannot allow that to be frozen in the present circumstances. I mean, that would just be unacceptable, I think, for everybody. So it doesn't always work. And on what you said, Selim, about circumventing US blockade in WTO, I think it's a very interesting example. And you talk about middle powers, but I'm not sure China and the EU, who are participating in this alternative mechanism, well, they're not exactly middle powers. I hope that also the EU you consider as a major player, kind of. But but I think indeed, if things are stuck and it is important, I mean, one way out might be to just try to work around it and not always go for everybody agreeing with everything. I mean, take Europe, we have Schengen, we have Euro, which were created without everybody participating. And I think we all agree that it works pretty well. And the others might join later. So, and again, WTO is a very interesting example in that respect. So that might also be a way out of certain problems.
From my perspective, I think that the most important thing is to have a ceasefire agreement, as we did, if we are referring to the Ukrainian conflict at the moment. Second, I think it's important when we are talking about the settlement to think about the reasoning that the countries were at war. Because in the case of Ukraine, it was clearly the Russian aggression. It was not something that Ukrainians wanted to or willing to enter into a war. They are defending their country, they are defending their independence, their sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think that this is very important to mention. And ceasefire, this is the first step, and afterwards already diplomacy comes in act in order to see how the conflict can be resolved further on. But first and foremost, as I mentioned, and this has to be taken on board when the ceasefire agreement is in place, to understand very clearly who entered the war and what were the reasoning behind it.
Thank you. And just to mention from my side, I think there are regions where we should already think now to prevent conflicts and wars, and one of them is the Arctic, the north, where European Union, US, China, Russia meet, and with the climate change there in this region, it can become a region of conflict or can become a region of cooperation. So I think I would agree that the way is open to go this or the other way if we start timing right in time, not when it's too late. So thank you very much. Any question? Or yes, the two.
My name is Peter Dieger. We blame the lack of diplomacy of the big powers, but where are the other 180 countries? Where's diplomacy of Europe, of the European Union? I don't mention Austrian diplomacy, which doesn't exist at all. So can the other countries come again to a sort of preparation of a Helsinki conference, where the smaller countries were very active? Why don't the other countries don't try to act as a peace builder in a common event.
Lady, yeah.
Thank you very much, Irene Gina Reichel, former member of the Austrian Diplomatic Service. I enjoyed very much the presentations. I'm very honored to be a member of Diplomats Without Borders as well. And I was wondering really around the issue of the role of multilateral organizations. The conflict resolution part was very much emphasized, and there we haven't been doing so well, or we haven't seen such great results recently. But there's also the mandate for international organizations to contribute to the production of global public goods. And there is really no possibility of producing these global public goods other than through cooperation. And I think there is still a lot to be done and a lot to be gained, actually, by engaging multilateral organizations. And that, I think, could also prevent the eruption of conflicts, at least in the medium term. I'm coming from the International Vienna Energy and Climate Forum, which is taking place today and tomorrow in the Hofburg. And it's around the issue of energy security, very much energy as a means to produce also prosperity and stability in the regions. And the regional dimension is also very much emphasized there. And on the role of the peace making through European efforts, I think there we also have to take into account that there are other parts of the world that have other views on many of the conflicts. And we have seen in the past most of the mediation efforts coming from other regions, the Gulf region, Turkey, now Pakistan, and we as Europeans have been conspicuously absent. So there is a reason for that also, because I think we hang on for too long, too much, to a world order that in reality no longer exists and that does not represent the interests of most of the world today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you, because you mentioned peace, I think it was at the beginning, you mentioned that the world is not so different as before because we also had many conflicts before, so it's not so different. But what is different now, I think, well, you also mentioned some differences. The conflicts now, and we saw it in Gaza, and we are seeing it now, and this, what is now happening in Lebanon, for example, is unbelievable, is not respect for international humanitarian law. You were talking about rules, international rules in general, but international humanitarian law, which is at least basic. The ambassador of Moldova was speaking about the human lives, and this is the most important. So attacking hospitals or children or whatever, this is something which is new. Why the international community, well, it has not been so new. It happened before, but we had the Geneva rules, and this is now very, very clear in these last conflicts we are seeing. How the international community could be more vocal against that, or to act to really not allow these things to happen. Thank you.
Second, the last one,
Tobias Lang, Austrian Center for Peace. Just to add up on the introductory statement regarding about the recent trends, I would add two more developments from my perspective. The first is the blunt disregard for diplomatic negotiations. We have seen it in Qatar when the Israelis bombed more or less the Hamas negotiation team while the negotiations were ongoing, and we have also seen it now with Iran. And the second one regarding ceasefires is also a very worrying development, which to me also seems to be new, the unequally implemented ceasefire, which is unequally designed. We've seen it with Gaza and with Lebanon, and it's not coming from the Trump administration, it's coming from the Biden administration, from Amos Hochstein, where one side has from the start more or less the right to break the ceasefire whenever the party feels necessary. Probably you can comment if this is really new or an old wine in a new bottle.
We'll make a second round afterwards. Who wants to start?
Well, perhaps, well, first of all, I think that that Irene, the second speaker, basically gave kind of an answer to the first question about what about other countries? Because indeed, there are quite a few countries that do play a very active role, intermediate mediator role, which is relatively new. The Gulf states, I mean, it's amazing, they are everywhere. And it is, I remember a few months ago, you saw two African presidents sitting within the middle, I think it was the Bahrain or one of these countries, and they were flown in there to agree on a peace deal. I think it was Rwanda was one of them. I forgot who the other one was. So in that sense, other countries are picking it up, not perhaps through multilateral organizations, but let's say on a more ad hoc basis, which is fine. If it works, why not? So in that sense, I think there are other countries more active. Second comment on what you said about rules-based international order and so on, and I totally agree that we, and when I say we, I mean let's call it Europe, we should realize that that order has served us very well, but many parts of the world, they have a totally different concept of it, and they see that, and again, the Gaza-Ukraine difference in our policies has created so much negativity in major parts of the rest of the world in terms of double standards, that we use the rules-based order when it suits us, but not when it does not. I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with these arguments, but I mean, I think we have to realize it and translate that into change of the Security Council, for example, and realize that we really have to look at the change, which is not the easiest to achieve. But I mean, there might be ways we're using more the General Assembly or whatever to do something about it. And in terms of the violation of humanitarian law, I mean, it is absolutely horrendous. In the Netherlands, and I think a few other countries as well, you have diplomats, active diplomats, and former diplomats, but also other intellectuals, so, who every Thursday, I think now for 3 years, have a sit-in every Thursday, and they are silent for half an hour, just to ask for attention for what's happening in Gaza. But again, what to do against? I mean, one, I'm not sure it's entirely new. I think if you would look at previous conflicts, also terrible things have happened. I mean, at my age, I mean, I remember even Vietnam. I mean, what happened there? Can you imagine that you use defoliants, or you call it, to annihilate the harvests, and at the same time, people still have cancer because of it, like these 60, 70 years later. So, I mean, I'm afraid it's not a really new phenomenon, and it is absolutely terrible what to do about it. But what it's called realpolitik, I guess.
Maybe it's less discussed publicly, but today, or justified even by some of the leaders, and that was not so much in the past. But anyway, any comment?
I'm not an EU member, so you can talk.
Not yet.
Well, maybe I would just talk about the international humanitarian law, because I think that is actually something that I think is relatively recent, the erosion of respect for international humanitarian law. That is not to say that there haven't been violations. There have been violations all along. But these violations were somewhat hidden, if you like, or explained away or something like this. But more recently, I don't think that Israel has tried to explain away anything or justify or whatever. So I think it is a relatively recent thing. But international humanitarian law, I think, depends a great deal on the consensus behind it. That is to say, there is an agreement. I mean, it is an international treaty, if you like, but there's no bite to it. If you violate it, there's nothing that can be done to make you comply. And that is what happens with a lot of these international treaties. And indeed, I think that is something that we have to bear in mind when we look at what is to be done about international organizations in the future. Because I think we are seeing compliance is important. And how do we do that? You know, the only way up until now has been to take a court case to the Hague. But even that has in some cases, very little teeth to it. So,
any answer to Tobias on this? Could you perhaps ask the second question?
Was the ceasefire, the non-equal ceasefire?
Non-equal ceasefires. Any answer to that, or not really?
Well, I mean, conflicts are always non-equal. So negotiations are always unequal as well. One side is winning, the other side is losing, or that's the impression. So negotiations are never fair. It's very rare that they are both on equal sides. And when do the negotiations start? When one side decides to start. So this is what we're seeing right now. Iran was already ready to negotiate, but the Americans were not. We've seen that in other conflicts as well. If you look at the Second World War, we've seen how the negotiations took place, in Japan as well. So it's the victor, of course, who decides when the negotiations start and end. What I've seen so far is that most wars do not resolve anything. Maybe the Second World War was an exception because of the way it started, but mostly in our era, what has any conflict resolved? None. I haven't seen anything happening. In the end, they're frozen because they have to be frozen, otherwise they're not going to resolve anything. But again, you know, in Korea, I have to go back to Korea. At least people are not dying because of war. They're dying for other reasons maybe, but they're not dying because of war. So what is the answer? Again, timing. Timing. And diplomacy, as I try to repeat, is a tool that has to be used by the leaders if they want to.
But isn't the issue that today wars, which perhaps is good or bad, that depends, don't result in one winner and other loser? Who wants, for example, take the Balkans, who was winning on the conflict between Kosovo and Serbia? There is no winner, there is no real loser. And that will be the case, of course, also in Ukraine. Because let's be honest, part of Ukraine will go to Russia if there's any solution. And there is no winner or the loser. Even in Iran, there's not very clear who is a winner and the loser. So we have that kind of different situation. We have probably we'll have two losers in some way. One more economically, the other maybe politically. So this is also one issue. A brief remark before we come to the second round on Europe. First of all, we should not be sad that other countries now go for mediation, like Pakistan and other countries. Of course, as Austrians, we always want to have all the meetings taking place here in Vienna. But I think we have to recognize that the world is changing and that other countries can take over these kind of jobs. And I understand that Vienna is complaining, Geneva is complaining, but that's the new reality. The second issue, of course, is the problem is that we are on defense very much dependent on the US, and that's a big issue anyway for the future, getting strength in the European Union, besides some question of unanimity, that without that strength and without more independence from the US, especially on the defense issue, Europe will never be strong enough to go for its own way and to have a strong word and power in these international relations. Now we have, I think, the ambassador, and then we have you. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Mustafa Kibaroğlu. I'm a Turkish permanent representative, recently appointed as such. I'm actually an academic for 30 years, 35 years, and professor of international relations. And I would like to take up from where Ambassador Selim Yenal just left. Diplomacy is an instrument. I mean, because provided that there is a political will, diplomats will work it out and will find a solution. Because, I mean, there are basically, I can think of two ways of solving a conflict when there are, conflict of interest. You either sit and negotiate and agree on certain things or fight. I mean, war. And both of which might take a lot of time. It might be prolonged conflicts, etc. So during the Cold War, there was always this fear of mutual annihilation. And during the Cold War, diplomats were very instrumental in solving problems such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, there was this threat of mutual annihilation because of nuclear power. But after the Cold War, there was this short period of hope where everybody thought, because of globalization and open societies and everything could be, negotiated. But especially after 9/11, things have changed. I don't want to, give any specific examples as to how and when and where power was started or used, and some leaders and some countries have resorted to power to protect their interests or achieve their objectives. So unless there is political will at the very top, diplomacy cannot be solving anything, because this is what we are now seeing. And with respect to Iran, I mean, I work on Iran's file for nearly 30 years. My first piece on Iran's nuclear program goes back to 1996. And again, during the 2003-2005 period, and there was this hope that Iran and Israel could really solve the disagreements. And I also cited some of the quotations from people who wanted to remain anonymous back then, but very influential and important people who were in government back then and also in afterwards. There was this part in my piece, shock therapy with Israel and grand bargain with the US. And that would mean, in return for Iran acknowledging and recognizing all UN resolutions, UN Security Council resolution regarding the Middle East, US and Iran would improve their relations, and recognition of all UN resolutions, UN Security Council resolutions regarding the Middle East would mean, by way of implication, recognition of Israel by Iran. So that would be a starting step. So, but the political will has been lost, and diplomacy can only be still, and still sitting idle. So diplomats will have to do, things that bring back their power and impose on the politicians that the way they approach issues may not necessarily solve problems. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. My name is Anastas Terzubodev. I'm from Sofia, Bulgaria. I'm representing one of the international peace and culture academy from Italy, Vatican. It is a pleasure and honor to be in this such important meeting in Taiwan. Thank you very much for your hospitality. Dear ambassadors, dear colleague and academic people, I fully agree that the diplomacy should be working very hardly for the new establishing the world and the peace. I fully agree that there is some diplomatic and there is some leader from European Union, from Turkish also, that coming back to the war between Islamic Republic Iran and United States, we need such of these people and such of this leader. I fully agree with the same comments which you are presenting, but I'm not agree about the state of Palestine, the genocide of the Palestine, the United Nations General Secretary statement and some other leader. This is the main conflict of the region. The Palestinian children and people, they need to be educated. They need to be supported by European Union and non-government organization and all other countries to be educated for the peace, for the constitution, for the dialogue. On my view, we are working with some cultural diplomacy with Sofia State University and some other university. We make some alliance that we are providing a lot of dialogue, agreement, exchanging of the students. So this is a view for the diplomacy. And the important thing for the main conflict on the moment, this is the religion. The religion, the state of the Palestine, the Lebanon on the other side, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which they are more than 1,000 years of culture, and a lot of academic people, a lot of university will not comment what they are going to do in the religion, but we need some of the European leaders to be more active and more active for the diplomatic, for the for the dialogue. Yes, because I'm going to give, for example, President Erdogan. The President Erdogan is one of the leaders in Turkey that saved this word, what was happening a few days ago. Yes, so I think the main reason this is the Palestine, the issue of the Palestine, because the children, this is the truth, the children of the Palestine, they're growing up with the guns, with the military. So after 10, 12 years, they are starting to fight. This is the truth, yes. Thank you very much.
May I take up at the end this issue again from the perspective of negotiations? You're right, you mentioned that the border between Israel and Egypt and Jordania are safe and negotiated. But why were not real negotiations afterwards in the sense of convincing also Israel to do something on the Palestinian issue? Not killing people and evicting people from the West Bank, but trying to find a solution. It's not easy, and I don't defend in any way Hamas and these terrorist groups, on the contrary. But we have neighbors. Saudi Arabia was at least not actively, or let's say was refraining from taking up diplomatic relations. We have countries like the Emirates taking up diplomatic relations without saying anything about the Palestinian people. So my question is, why is there would be the chance of negotiation and say, look, we agree, we will recognize Israel, we will have a common front maybe against Iran in its expansionist and aggressive policies, because we don't have an interest either on that kind of Iran, and we see now the result, and there was nothing done. So why do you think was there no effort, at least, to go into negotiations? Maybe with some help of Turkey, but Turkey even was now excluded from the famous Ball of Peace by Mr. Trump. So I think I'm a bit skeptical that negotiations could bring peace, or at least some sort of restraint activities from Israel, for example. And the same can be true also about Iran. Iran was not only the nuclear issue. Iran had a very aggressive policy. They destroyed, together with Hezbollah, Lebanon. They were supporting this awful regime in Syria. So they were not just one issue with the different countries. We have, especially in the Middle East, but not only there, we have two powers, Iran and Israel, who at least until now did what they want to do. And now we have that war, which will not really change the situation. And where is diplomacy? That's my question.
Well, that's a suggestion for a next debate, perhaps next week.
We have a debate on Tuesday around with one of your members.
Yeah. No, just on Iran. Again, we understand that there was really a serious perspective of an agreement when the war started. So in that sense, with Iran, negotiations seemed to be possible. And it was almost there, and they had agreed to all kinds of the percentage that uranium could be enriched and so on. So,
but Trump recently, sorry to interrupt, Trump recently said they only did it in order to win time.
Well, who broke up the negotiations? I don't think it was Iran.
No. It was the US.
Exactly, yeah. But so Iran is reasonable in terms of negotiation. So again, if there would be a situation where there would be negotiations, I think a deal Iran is possible. Israel is a bit of a perhaps even more difficult case. And again, talking about engaging and trying to understand the other side. Of course, we all understand why Israel is so incredibly, let's say, worried about its situation. I think that is a very understandable position. Having said it, of course, what they're doing is so counterproductive and unacceptable according to many standards. So perhaps on Israel, of course, you have the position of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his internal problems with legal problems and so on. But there, perhaps, for example, Europe could do a bit more. I mean, we still have this agreement with Israel that we could freeze or that we could block or whatever, which we don't do. So there is still room, perhaps, for Europe to put more pressure than we're doing at present. Last comment, to end on a slightly more optimistic note about what can diplomacy do. We are about to elect a new Secretary General of the UN. And we have to realize, I think we all agree that the present one did not really make maximum use of the potential of that function, which after all is the highest diplomat in the world. So if he or she doesn't do it, hopefully a she, I mean, then it's difficult, but hopefully that a next one will act more in the spirit of Utant and a few of the previous ones, who did play a role, even with the major powers. I mean, they took their responsibility and they flew to Moscow, they flew to wherever to say, I'm representing the world community. And risk is that they will not elect somebody who would do such a thing, but let's be optimistic.
Yes, please.
Well, I mean, you presented in a very sensible way, but the region doesn't have these sensible people. So let's be blunt. Both sides have to have sensible people at the same time, again. And therefore, the interests have to merge, but they collide all the time. And Israel has always thought that they have the upper hand. Also, you have to try to understand the Israeli psyche. They always have a fear of being annihilated from Iran or some other people. So they're always on the verge of acting before anybody else. Not that I condone it, but we have to understand why they're doing what they're doing right now. Therefore, it's very difficult to find a sensible common ground for people to negotiate. And unless you find the sensible people, then you can only ask these questions and it'll be basically theoretical, sorry to say.
Yeah. Sensible people and or leverage points. I mean, let's be clear, really the only country that can make Israel do anything is the United States. And the United States at this point is doing the reverse. So timing is everything. But when the negotiation happened between Israel and Egypt, that was pushed really by the United States at that time, and it held. So you know.
You had a courageous leader also.
You had a courageous leader in Egypt. You had a courageous leader in the United States as well, and so it's
even in Israel.
And in Israel. So timing is important. Leverage is important as well.
Thank you. Anything? So we're all looking for a sensible person who is courageous on the top of the UN. If you have any suggestion, we had some weeks ago we had a debate on the UN, and that was also our conclusion, including hopefully a woman, but mostly important, sensible, and courageous. So we're still looking and hope to find somebody. And thank you very much for your contributions. And thank you for coming. And on next Tuesday, we have a debate on Iran. And what is the exact title? The Iran struggle for survival and what the consequences of the whole war is. So it's a question on the East and the situation as it will be. We never know if it will be a fragile truce or will be still a war. Let's hope again to be optimistic that some sensible people at the end, also a sensible person on top of the US would also be quite fruitful and helpful for diplomacy. Thank you for coming and maybe you have some time to discuss.